December 22nd, 1944, Elsenborn Ridge, Belgium. Before dawn, the snow did not fall so much as hang in the air, a pale dust turning the darkness thick and close. The frozen fields were hard as iron. Pine boughs sagged with white weight. The road ditches had become narrow graves of ice, and every sound carried strangely in the cold. The crack of a branch, the creak of leather, the scrape of a spade blade biting frozen earth, the distant rumble of guns somewhere behind the American line. In front of the ridge, German infantry moved through the half-light in broken files, shoulders hunched, rifles clutched tight, boots slipping on glassy ground. Some ducked behind stone walls, some pressed into shallow folds in the earth, some vanished into the tree line where men had always believed the forest could hide them. And behind the ridge, where the darkness was busier than the front ever suspected, another wooden ammunition crate was pried open in the snow. The lid split with a dry crack. Inside lay rows of American shells, clean and cold and waiting. To the men advancing through that Belgian winter, cover still meant survival. A ditch was a ditch, a cellar was a cellar, a stand of fir trees was shelter. The old rules of artillery still seemed to hold. If the shell struck the ground, the earth itself might spare you. But on that ridge, in that winter, the rules were changing. The German soldiers crouching low against American fire did not yet understand that the thing hunting them was no longer only the shell. It was the system behind it. The clocks, the radios, the forward observers, the guns stacked beyond the horizon, and the republic of factories that kept sending steel into wooden crates by the thousand. What happened on Elsenborn Ridge mattered because Hitler's last great gamble in the West depended on speed shock and road space. The Ardennes offensive was designed to tear open the Allied front, rush across Belgium, seize Antwerp, and fracture the Anglo-American alliance with one savage winter stroke. The German army had done this before in another form, in another season, against other enemies. Strike through difficult country, exploit hesitation, turn surprise into panic, and let movement become victory. On December 16th, the opening barrage crashed across a 100-mile front at 0530, and much of the American line bent or broke under the impact. Entire sectors reeled. Men were captured in the woods, killed in foxholes, or pushed back in confusion through villages whose names would soon become grave markers. Yet the northern shoulder, around the villages of Rocherath, Krinkelt, and the heights near Elsenborn, did not collapse in the way German planners required. Historians later noted that while Bastogne would become the legend, the true crusher of the offensive lay farther north, where American infantry divisions and their artillery denied the Germans the ground, road junctions, and tempo they needed. The battle as a whole would cost the United States more than 83,000 casualties, the largest battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. But statistics alone cannot convey the strategic cruelty of that frozen week. If the ridge fell cleanly and quickly, the northern thrust had room to breathe. If it held, the offensive began to suffocate under its own ambition. So the ridge became more than geography. It became a hinge in time. On one side stood an army still dangerous, still disciplined, still capable of violence on a continental scale. On the other stood an American force that many in Germany still imagined as clumsy, comfortable, and materially spoiled. Between them lay snow, forest, village streets, and a widening belief among German troops that the Americans might be something worse than fanatics, something richer, colder, and harder to outlast. There was an emotional trap inside German confidence, and by late 1944, many German soldiers were living inside it. They had been raised on a creed of hardness. They had been told that war belonged to the disciplined, the ruthless, the ideologically committed. They had been taught to see democracies as soft civilizations, rich but weak, powerful but decadent, full of comforts that would collapse under blood and weather. The Americans especially carried this image in German imagination. Noisy, overfed, technically impressive perhaps, but spiritually inferior to the supposedly sterner peoples of Europe. Even when this stereotype had already begun to die in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy, it still lingered. A soldier who believed his enemy was materialistic could still tell himself that material never won battles on its own. Yet that illusion became dangerous when facing American artillery, because American material was never only material. It was organization. It was doctrine. It was trained procedure. It was a rifleman on a ridge linked by radio to guns he could not see, in batteries he would never visit, fed by roads and depots and trucks and maps and crews who had rehearsed destruction as a science. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, studying the Allied artillery war, admitted what German ideology did not want to confess. In Italy, he observed that the enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, has broken the front open. In Normandy, he added that the Allies showed great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition. Earlier, in fighting around Kasserine, he remarked on an observation plane directing the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets. That was the buried revelation of the war in the West. The Americans were not merely firing more. They were seeing more, moving faster, calculating better, and linking every part of the battlefield to every other part. For German infantry, this meant that the old instincts, drop flat, hug the ground, wait for the burst to pass, were increasingly unreliable. A man could still do everything experience had taught him and die exactly where doctrine said he should be safest. The heart of the nightmare was not just the gun line. It was the American fire direction system, a quiet architecture of mathematics and discipline built long before the snow of the Ardennes. At Fort Sill, the U.S. Army had developed fire direction centers into places where artillery could be allocated, shifted, and concentrated with startling speed. One observer saw a target. One radio carried the coordinates. One center solved the geometry. And then batteries miles apart answered as if they were fingers of a single hand. In the uniquely American method called time on target, a fire direction center broadcast a countdown. Each battery calculated its shell's time of flight, and every gun fired at a slightly different moment so the first rounds from all of them arrived together. To men under it, there was almost no warning, no gradual build, no chance to hear one battery, then move before the next joined in. The sky simply opened at once. Its effect, one account noted, was shattering. Behind this precision stood mobility the Wehrmacht increasingly could not match. German horse-drawn artillery might manage 25 miles a day before the animals needed rest. Under favorable conditions, an American heavy artillery battalion could road march up to 160 miles in a day. German ammunition shortages strangled volume and consistency. American supply fed continuity. In Normandy, German artillery supporting 5th Panzer Army could fire only about 10% of what the British fired. In other sectors, shell quality declined so badly that dude rates crippled effectiveness. The United States, by contrast, turned industrial abundance into battlefield rhythm. That was the real meaning of the wooden ammunition crate opening in the snow. It was not merely a box of shells, it was a promise kept across an ocean. In a dictatorship, the state consumed men and fed them ideology. In a democracy at war, shipyards, rail lines, union labor, farm output, drafting rooms, motor pools, and gun crews all met invisibly in one rectangle of pine boards and stenciled numbers. When the lid came off, what emerged was not just metal. It was a national system made visible. The first proof came in the twin villages before the ridge fully earned its name and memory. On December 16th, after the opening German barrage, infantry from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division struck the 99th Infantry Division near Rocherath. The fighting was close, confused, murderous. Woods funneled men into killing zones. Houses became fortresses and traps at once. The 99th held longer than expected, even as other parts of the front gave way. On the 17th, with flanks exposed and the German spearheads pressing harder, the 12th SS Panzer Division and supporting formations drove against the sector with fresh violence. Some American positions in the woods cracked. Survivors fell back through Rocherath and crinkled in disorder. And for a moment, the road beyond seemed to open. Then came the counterweight the Germans had not mastered into their calculations. The National World War II Museum's account describes salvation arriving in the form of infantry from the 2nd Division and incredibly heavy artillery fire that dropped onto the Germans like rain. That image matters because rain is impersonal, broad, inescapable. American guns fired on pre-registered points along the routes of advance, and with armor support, they halted the German momentum and turned it back. Assault followed assault. A first attack was stopped, a second was stopped, a third was stopped. Even where ammunition ran short in the villages and German tanks finally forced local withdrawals, the larger operational pattern had already begun to harden. German armor might roll through a street, but every delay multiplied American advantage behind the line. Every hour bought time for more guns, more ammunition, more surveyed targets, more coordinated defensive fire. Men in field gray and camouflage smocks entered Belgian villages expecting a breakthrough and instead found themselves crossing a landscape already memorized by enemy gunners. The road was not empty ground. The road was a sentence awaiting pronunciation. And behind the houses, behind the orchard walls, behind the churchyards glazed with frost, more ammunition crates kept opening. By the time the struggle settled onto Elsenborn Ridge itself, the American artillery concentration had become almost mythic to the infantry it supported. Survivors later passed along stories that the guns were stacked wheel to wheel. The stories, the museum notes, were not far from the truth. More than 300 heavy artillery pieces, 155 millimeter, 105 millimeter, 75 millimeter, and 4.2-inch chemical mortars backed the infantry along the ridge and around Buchenbach. On December 22nd alone, the artillerymen fired 10,000 rounds against German attacks. In front of the 26th Infantry's positions alone, American Graves registration later counted some 782 German dead. The burnt-out hulks of 47 German tanks lay across the landscape. There was simply no way, the account concludes, that anything could or ever would penetrate the ring of steel formed by the American infantry and their supporting artillery. And now, the old logic of taking cover became not just uncertain, but treacherous. A shell fitted with a VT or proximity, fuse did not need to strike the frozen ground to kill. It detonated above it, at a calculated height, scattering fragments across a wider lethal circle. Men who had thrown themselves flat into snow-filled depressions found that the burst was no longer absorbed by earth, but spread downward from the sky. Woods became instruments of murder, because air bursts and tree bursts transformed branches into splinters and steel into descending knives. A patrol in the Hürtgen forest had already shown what such fire could do. One recorded Posit-Tot mission left 96 German dead. One German prisoner described these attacks as quick, powerful bursts for which there was simply no defense. No defense. It is a rare phrase in soldiers' testimony because soldiers are trained to believe that somewhere in training or courage or fieldcraft, a defense always exists. But artillery of this kind unmade that faith. Men who dug deeper died where they had dug. Men who ran died in the open. Men who hugged the roots of fir trees died beneath the fir trees. The forest, the ditch, the wall, the cellar, the familiar grammar of survival was being rewritten above their heads. American commanders understood, perhaps before the German frontline soldier did, that they were watching not just a tactical advantage, but a transformation in the meaning of artillery. General George Patton, describing the new fuse after its battlefield use, wrote with almost boyish astonishment, "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating." He recounted catching a German battalion trying to cross the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killing 702 by actual count. Then came the sentence that reveals how deeply the technology unsettled traditional military thought. "I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare." That is what Elsenborn and the frozen battles around it exposed. Not merely a stronger barrage, but an altered battlefield where mass, timing, and detonation fused into something close to mechanical fate. Official U.S. Army histories later judged that American artillery played a crucial part throughout the Bulge. By December 23rd, U.S. forces had brought 4,155 guns into action and fired 1,255,000 rounds during the battle. Artillery often diverted German attacks from their intended axis of advance and derailed German schemes of maneuver, even without causing maximum physical damage. That detail is important because war is not only a contest of bodies destroyed, it is a contest of intentions broken. A barrage that shatters timing can shatter an offensive. A road jam caused by fear can be as decisive as a bridge demolished. German commanders, pressed by poor reconnaissance, inadequate road networks, weather, fuel shortages, and piecemeal commitment, discovered that every delay on the northern shoulder allowed American artillery to deepen its grip. This was why the ridge felt cursed to those trying to take it. It was not just that the guns killed. It was that they interrupted the future the Germans were trying to force into being. The offensive needed motion. The artillery imposed hesitation, dispersion, and dread. Men who believed themselves the spearhead of history were being nailed in place by invisible mathematics. For the German soldier in the snow, the change was psychological before it was philosophical. At first, there was still the old confidence that skill could master fire. A veteran could read terrain. He could identify dead ground. He could move by hedgerow, by draw, by copse, by ditch. He could tell himself that American gunners, for all their weight of metal, still needed time, still needed adjustment, still needed luck. Then came the first barrage that arrived all at once, then the second, landing not where he had been, but where retreat would carry him. Then the third, bursting above cover instead of into it. At some point, the mind stopped thinking of artillery as support for the enemy and began to feel it as the battlefield itself, an atmosphere in which all movement was judged and all concealment provisional. This is where expectation and reality split completely apart. German troops had been taught to expect the American soldier as an individual opponent, worse trained perhaps, more dependent on machines, less inwardly hardened. But what they met in places like Elsenborn was not the isolated American as stereotype. They met the American system, observer aircraft over the front, FM radios carrying coordinates, fire direction centers, solving trajectories, trucks outrunning horse teams, ammunition arriving in industrial abundance, and gun crews able to turn all of that into immediate violence. A dictatorship had promised superiority of will. A democracy answered with superiority of combination. That, more than the shell bursts alone, changed perception. The wooden ammunition crate became the truer flag of America in that winter than any poster or speech. Open it and you found not only a shell, but the labor of machinists in Ohio, chemists in laboratories, farmers feeding the transport chain, sailors guarding convoy lanes, railroad crews, ordnance depots, clerks, engineers, and citizen soldiers bound together without ever seeing one another. To the man, the abundance behind it meant something different from Nazi abundance. One system hoarded, plundered, enslaved, and consumed. The other mobilized, produced, shipped, coordinated, and shared. That difference did not make the shells less lethal. It made their meaning different. When the firing finally moved on and the snow settled again over the ridge, what remained was more than wreckage. There were tracks frozen into roads, black tank hulks in white fields, ruptured trees, broken walls, and those wooden ammunition crates split open and left in drifts behind the guns, as if the Republic had shed its husks there while saving itself. The Germans who survived carried away a lesson no doctrine book had prepared them to absorb, that freedom, when organized and armed, could be terrifyingly efficient. That abundance was not softness. That a society of citizens, arguments, elections, factories, farms, unions, churches, immigrant names, county roads, and distant towns could gather its strength into steel and time it to the second. On Elsenborn Ridge, men took cover, believing the earth still negotiated with artillery. American fire ended that bargain. It burst above them, around them, into the trees and across the snow, until shelter itself felt faithless. And in that betrayal of old battlefield instincts lay a larger truth about the war. Tyranny had wagered that fear, obedience, and myth could conquer a freer world before that world properly awakened. But when the lid came off the crate in the snow, when the countdown moved through the radio net, when the shells rose from guns stacked wheel to wheel and arrived together over the ridge, another idea announced itself with terrible clarity. Free nations could learn, could build, could endure, and could answer violence with a scale of disciplined force that dictators mistook for weakness until it was too late. And pinned in a Belgian ditch, democracy did not arrive as an abstract principle. It arrived as punctual fire. It arrived as resupply. It arrived in the fact that the guns did not fall silent when they should have, by every prior rule of exhaustion, gone quiet. And so the Ridge performed a slow work on ideology, not through pamphlets, not through speeches, but through experience. The young SS Panzergrenadier, the Volksgrenadier pulled from a shrinking Reich, the veteran NCO who still believed the Western enemy lacked endurance, all of them were forced to learn in fragments of pain what the war had become. On the frozen northern shoulder, the offensive penetrated no farther than about 6 miles past the German border, aside from Kampfgruppe Piper's separate thrust to the south. By denying the Germans Elsenborn Ridge and the surrounding territory, the American divisions blocked the main thrust of Hitler's last offensive in the west. In the aftermath, survivors from both sides described scenes like Dante's Inferno. Dead SS Panzer Grenadiers, some only 15 and 16, lay as common as grass. The phrase is terrible because grass belongs to peace, to ordinary fields, to a world where youth should be growing rather than lying still beneath snow. Yet war on that ridge leveled everything into material. Frozen flesh, broken tracks, Shell fragments, splintered timber, church walls, shattered carts, blackened panthers. The Germans had expected to master the field through shock. Instead, they were mastered by a concentration of American firepower that was industrial without being soulless, because it was animated by men defending one another. The American gun lines were not abstract machines. They were crewed by citizens whose comrades froze in foxholes ahead of them. The artillery existed to keep those foxholes from being overrun. There is a democratic morality, harsh but real, in that kind of fire. Not the cult of destruction for its own glory, but destruction summoned in defense of men already in danger. Even long after the dead were buried and the guns were hauled away, that is what the Winter of Elsenborn still says. Freedom is not always gentle. Abundance is not always comfort. Sometimes democracy sounds like wood breaking open in the dark, a shell lifted out by gloved hands, a countdown in a cold headset, and then a sky that belongs not to the men who seized power, but to the men who refused to surrender it.